Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today we're going deep into the world of biblical interpretation. Specifically, we're going to be looking at a sermon by John MacArthur titled, "Does the Bible Permit a Woman to Preach?" Now this is a long one, so we're here to break it down for you. Unpack his arguments, look closely at the scriptures that he's using, and really explore what all of this means for us today. You ready to jump in?
I am ready.
All right, so to kick things off, can you give us just a quick rundown of MacArthur's main point? What's his stance on women preaching?
Well, to put it bluntly, MacArthur believes that women preaching is a big no-no. He uses some strong words, calling it a disgrace. That goes against God's order. And he doesn't see this as just a cultural thing or a personal preference. He claims it's a universal command from God that applies to all churches, everywhere, always.
Yeah, well, that's a pretty strong statement. So where does he get this idea? What's the foundation for this argument?
MacArthur takes us all the way back to the Garden of Eden, specifically to the curse on women in Genesis 3.16. It's the part where God tells Eve, "Your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you." Now, many people interpret this as just kind of a natural longing for connection within marriage, but MacArthur sees it differently.
Hmm. Okay, so how does he interpret that verse?
He argues that it's not about a healthy desire for intimacy. Instead, he believes it points to a sinful desire in women to dominate their husbands, disrupting the order that God intended.
That's a pretty intense interpretation.
Right.
So he's basically saying that women have this inherent desire to take control, and that's why they shouldn't be in positions of authority.
Exactly. And to really hammer that point home, he draws a parallel to Genesis 4.7, where God talks to Cain about sin. God says, "Sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it." MacArthur uses the same language of desire to highlight what he believes is a natural tendency in women to rebel against God's order.
I see. So he's connecting Eve's desire in Genesis 3.16 to Cain's temptation to sin. It sounds like he's laying the groundwork for this idea that women are inherently more susceptible to, I don't know, maybe straying from God's plan.
That's a great way to put it. He's establishing this framework where women, because of the curse, have this built-in inclination to challenge God's authority.
Okay, so we've got the Garden of Eden, the curse, this inherent desire for dominance. It's all starting to come together. But how does he connect this to the actual act of preaching? Does he get into any New Testament passages?
Oh, he definitely does. MacArthur's go-to verse is 1 Corinthians 14.34-35, where Paul writes, "Women should remain silent in the churches. They are not allowed to speak, but must be in submission, as the law says. If they want to inquire about something, they should ask their own husbands at home, for it is disgraceful for a woman to speak in the church."
Yeah.
And just to emphasize how serious he is about this, MacArthur points to that strong language Paul uses, words like disgraceful and shameful.
Whoa, okay. So based on that passage, MacArthur believes that women speaking up in church is completely off limits.
You got it. And he takes it a step further, connecting it back to that Genesis curse we talked about. He sees Paul's instructions as a direct response to women's inherent inclination to rebel against silence and try to seize control.
So for MacArthur, it's almost like women are hardwired to challenge authority, and that's why they need to be explicitly told to be quiet in church.
Interesting. But hold on a second. Doesn't the Bible talk about women teaching too? How does he square that with this whole silence in the church thing?
That's a sharp observation. And you're right, the Bible does mention women teaching. To address this, MacArthur points to Titus 2.355, where older women are instructed to teach younger women. But here's the catch. He argues that the type of teaching allowed is very specific.
Okay, so what are the older women allowed to teach the younger women? What's the approved curriculum, so to speak? It's all about domestic duties, according to MacArthur. The passage mentions things like loving their husbands and children, being good homemakers, and submitting to their husbands. MacArthur sees these as the good works that women should prioritize.
So for MacArthur, teaching is okay as long as it's confined to the home and focuses on traditional women's roles. It's like he's drawing a very clear line between teaching within the family and the kind of public teaching that happens in church.
Precisely. He maintains a very rigid distinction between those two spheres. And to further support this distinction, he brings in examples from the Old Testament. He highlights the fact that there weren't any female priests, kings, or prophets with ongoing ministries.
But wait a minute, what about figures like Miriam, Deborah, and Huldah? They were pretty powerful women in the Old Testament, right? They held significant roles.
They absolutely did, and MacArthur acknowledges those exceptions. But he doesn't see them as contradicting his argument. He frames them as extraordinary situations where God worked despite the natural order, not as endorsements of women in leadership.
Ah, I see. So for MacArthur, they're the outliers, not the rule. He's really building a comprehensive case here, isn't he? Does he bring up any other Old Testament examples to support his point?
He does, and it's a pretty dramatic one. He points to Isaiah 3, where women's pride and rebellion are depicted as leading to weak men, and ultimately the downfall of the nation. He uses this as a cautionary tale, highlighting the danger of women stepping outside their God-ordained roles.
Wow, that's quite a consequence. Okay, so we've covered Genesis, Corinthians, Titus, and now Isaiah. It's clear that MacArthur is pulling from a range of biblical texts to support his argument. But we're not done yet, are we? There's more to unpack, right?
Yeah, there's more. We've only just begun to scratch the surface of MacArthur's argument.
Okay, I'm all ears. I'm ready to dive deeper. What other passages does MacArthur use to support his view?
Well, next he turns to another passage that often comes up in discussions about women's roles, 1 Timothy 2.9, 4:15. This is where Paul gives instructions about how women should dress and behave, emphasizing modesty, good works, and submissiveness. And of course, he reiterates that whole remain silent in church idea.
Ah, yes, 1 Timothy 2. It's definitely a passage that sparks a lot of debate. What's fascinating is that MacArthur connects these seemingly practical instructions back to those huge theological concepts he introduced earlier.
Exactly. He's weaving it all together. He sees 1 Timothy 2 as reinforcing the created order, pointing back to Adam being created first, then Eve. And he also links it to the consequences of the fall, highlighting Eve's deception and Adam's sin.
So he's tying those instructions about women's behavior to the very foundation of human history and the nature of sin. It's almost like he's saying that women's subordination is built into the fabric of creation itself, and that any attempt to change that is a rebellion against God's design.
That's a great way to summarize his view. He sees it as a fundamental issue of order and authority. And to really drive that point home, he points to the strong language Paul uses in 1 Timothy 2, specifically that phrase, entire submissiveness.
Entire submissiveness. Wow, that's pretty intense. There's no room for interpretation there, is there?
Not according to MacArthur. He interprets this as a clear directive for women to always be under male authority, whether in the home or in the church.
Okay, I'm starting to get a clearer picture of his overall argument. But there's one part of that passage that always trips me up. It's the part where Paul says, women will be saved through childbearing. What in the world does that mean? Is he saying you get a free pass to heaven if you have kids?
That's a common question, and one that MacArthur addresses head on. He clarifies that this verse isn't about earning salvation by popping out babies. Instead, he interprets it as women finding fulfillment and, in a sense, reversing the curse of the fall by raising godly children.
Oh, I see. So it's more about restoring the intended order through motherhood, not about some kind of magical salvation through childbirth. That makes a lot more sense. But so far, we've mostly focused on the restrictions on women. What about the men? What does MacArthur say about their role in all of this?
That's a great question, and it leads us to another key passage, 1 Timothy 3.45, which talks about qualifications for church leaders. This passage says that a man aspiring to be an overseer must be one who manages his own household well, keeping his children submissive and respectful.
Okay, so good leadership in the church starts with good leadership in the home. Makes sense.
Right, and MacArthur takes this a step further, arguing that managing the household is essentially the training ground for managing the church. And since in his view, women aren't supposed to be the heads of their households, they definitely shouldn't be leading the church, it all circles back to maintaining that order of authority he keeps emphasizing.
I'm seeing the pattern here. It's all about consistency and maintaining that hierarchical structure. But I'm sure some people are thinking, wait a minute, what about 1 Corinthians 11? Doesn't Paul talk about women praying and prophesying in that chapter? How does MacArthur deal with that seemingly contradictory passage?
You're right, that passage does seem to throw a wrench in the whole silence in the church idea. But MacArthur has an explanation, of course. He argues that the main point of 1 Corinthians 11 isn't about women speaking up in church, but about wearing head coverings, which was a cultural custom at the time.
Ah, yes, the head covering debate. It's one of those topics that always seems to generate strong opinions. Okay, so how does MacArthur connect head coverings to the larger issue of women in ministry?
For MacArthur, it's all about maintaining clear distinctions between men and women, and he sees head coverings as a symbol of that distinction. It's not just about modesty. It's a visual representation of women's submission to male authority.
So for him, even the way people dress in church is a way of upholding that order and hierarchy he's so concerned about.
Exactly. And he even links this to contemporary debates about gender identity and the blurring of lines between masculinity and femininity. He sees this as a dangerous trend that goes against God's design.
It's like he's saying that if we loosen up on traditional gender roles, even in something as seemingly simple as clothing, we're opening the door to chaos and a rejection of God's authority.
That's a great summary of his perspective. He believes that these distinctions are crucial for maintaining order in both the church and society as a whole.
Okay, so we've gone through a whole bunch of passages, Genesis, Corinthians, Titus, Isaiah, and now First Timothy. MacArthur has certainly built a detailed case against women preaching. But does he ever talk about what happens when churches actually follow his interpretation? What are the practical implications of all this?
Yeah, he does. He actually spends a good chunk of his sermon talking about what happens when churches don't follow his interpretation. And he really doesn't hold back.
Yeah, I'm kind of nervous to hear this, but go on.
Well, he uses some really strong language, comparing the rise of women preachers to a full-blown rebellion against God. He even goes so far as to call churches that embrace female leadership monstrous.
Wow, those are some serious accusations. He's not pulling any punches, is he? It's like he sees this as a fundamental threat to Christianity itself.
That's exactly his point. He believes that allowing women to preach undermines the very authority of the Bible and leads to a distorted understanding of the gospel.
So it's not just about women being quiet, it's about upholding a very specific interpretation of Scripture and a particular view of what the church should look like.
You got it. And to highlight just how widespread this perceived threat has become, he brings up some statistics about the growing number of women in ministry roles. He points out that 27% of pastors in the U.S. are women, a significant jump from just a few decades ago. He also mentions the increasing number of women enrolled in seminaries, and even teaching at those institutions.
Those are pretty significant numbers. It sounds like he's trying to create a sense of urgency, like the church is on a slippery slope toward abandoning biblical truth.
Absolutely, he's sounding the alarm, warning that the church is being infiltrated by feminist ideas that are eroding its foundation.
Okay, so he's painted a pretty bleak picture of what happens when churches stray from his interpretation of Scripture. But does he offer any positive examples? What does a church that adheres to his view actually look like?
He actually spends a good chunk of his sermon praising the women in his own church, Grace Community Church. He commends them for being sweet, graceful, kind, and tender-hearted.
So he's not anti-woman. He just believes they have a specific role to play in the church, and that role doesn't include preaching.
Exactly. He values women's contributions, but he believes those contributions should be expressed through roles that align with his understanding of biblical womanhood. He emphasizes things like raising godly children, supporting their husbands, and creating a nurturing environment within the church.
It's a very traditional view of gender roles, with men as the leaders and providers, and women as the nurturers and homemakers.
You got it. And to really drive home the importance of maintaining those distinct roles, he connects it to a broader societal issue, the breakdown of the family.
Ah, yes, there's a common theme among conservative Christians, the decline of the traditional family structure. But how does he tie that into his argument about women preaching?
He argues that the rise of individualism and the rejection of traditional gender roles have led to the disintegration of the family. And he sees this as a direct result of abandoning the biblical order of authority and submission.
So in his view, the feminist movement and the push for women's equality are not just bad for society, they're also a direct attack on the church and its authority.
Exactly. He sees it all as connected. The breakdown of the family leads to the breakdown of society, which ultimately leads to the corruption of the church.
It's a pretty comprehensive and, let's be honest, a pretty controversial worldview. He's placing a lot of blame on women's shoulders. The fall of humanity, the breakdown of the family, the corruption of the church. It's a lot to process. But you know what? I'm actually really glad we dug into his argument so thoroughly, because now we can start to ask some critical questions.
You're right. Understanding his perspective is essential for engaging in a meaningful conversation about this issue. And let's be real, there's another side to this story, isn't there?
Oh, absolutely. We've spent a lot of time unpacking MacArthur's view, but there are other scholars and theologians who have very different interpretations of these passages. They challenge his conclusions and offer alternative perspectives on women's roles in the church.
Right. It's important to remember that biblical interpretation isn't a one-size-fits-all thing. There are many different approaches, and not everyone agrees with MacArthur's very literal and hierarchical reading of these texts.
So let's talk about those alternative interpretations in our next deep dive. Until then, thanks for joining us and keep on thinking critically.